Hello there and Happy New Year. My name is Hannah Maswani and I am here for the very first Think About It Thursday of 2022. So if you celebrate the new year or any of the holidays beforehand, we wish you all well from the YWCA. So for this very first Think About It Thursday, while we could kick off on a celebratory note, for those of you who know me, you know it's pretty much not my style. So we're going to be talking a little bit about racial battle fatigue. We've been through 2020, we've been through 2021, and as much as we really truly hope 2022 gives us a wee bit of solace and respite from all of the chaos ever, it's important for us to acknowledge that even if it does, even if it doesn't, that a lot of us are out here struggling a wee bit with what is known as racial battle fatigue. So it is the 1 year anniversary of January 6th, and for some folks, this has been heavy on our hearts and minds, and for others, maybe it hasn't been. But there's a sense of fatigue, of overwhelm, of just being burnt out that comes with a lot of conversations around issues of identity, issues of politics, and in particular, issues of race and gender. So I'm highlighting racial battle fatigue today because for any fellow folks of color watching, I see you. And then for any white allies who want to be continue to be good allies or be better allies, I think it's an important topic to address. So this term was coined in 2008 by Dr. William Smith. No, not Will Smith. And it refers to the cumulative stress response that comes from being a person of color, particularly a Black individual, in a predominantly white society. So when I say a predominantly white society, I'm not exclusively talking about census data. I'm talking about everything from our workspaces, everything from our academic settings, our social settings, the music that we listen to, the movies and TV we listen to, is pretty much geared towards a white audience, right? When we learn about American history, typically we learn about capital A America and the majority of the chapter. Then we learn about a few folks of color and maybe a few women too, right? So when I talk about racial battle fatigue, it is the sum of all of this, right? It's this exhaustion that comes about in varying waves and degrees of being oftentimes the only Black person or the only person of color who typically has to deal with a lot of casually insensitive remarks, maybe deliberately insensitive. You can't turn on the news without hearing about some race-related or race-motivated crime, right? So it's this sort of pile-on principle of things just feel really, really hard in massive ways, but then also in those nitty-gritty interpersonal ways too, right? So with racial battle fatigue, again, Dr. William Smith says that it is a public health and mental health illness and honestly a crisis, right? So we've probably all heard the term microaggressions, right? Or what are often known as mini instances of racism. Things like being told, oh, you speak English really well for an immigrant, or you're so articulate. Things that may be backhanded compliments on purpose, or things like, you're Muslim. Why do Muslims do this, that, and the other, right? So these mini assaults are part of a larger system that allows these microaggressions to continue, right? So Dr. Smith here coined this term to put a name to that feeling of exhaustion that particularly affects people of color. So for any folks who are watching who are not folks of color, perhaps you can identify with the feeling of maybe being the only woman in a space, right? And having all of those really annoying jokes of like, oh, are you going to make cookies for the meeting? Or, oh, it must be that time of month. You know what I mean? Those really sort of, they grate on your nerves. Or to a lesser extent in terms of systemic issues, maybe you studied medicine, maybe you're a practicing doctor. Have you got into a room and have everybody ask you to diagnose that weird itch? Or like, hey, I've got this question for you. And then suddenly you're on the job. It's like that, but to the nth degree, right? So when we talk about racial battle fatigue, it's this notion that folks of a different or minoritized identity group are expected to be the token or spokesperson for that group. So if you've watched any of my videos before, you know that I'm pretty open in terms of my own identity, and it's quite literally my job to be a spokesperson or to rather try and do some education around that. But there's been times when I've either just been going to the doctor or going to a work meeting where it was nothing about race in a previous job and being asked to speak about one of my identities in ways that are accusatory or just don't feel so great, right? So when we mention racial battle fatigue, it is this combined psychological, physiological, and behavioral stress that we deal with. So we all know, even though 2021 feels like it's still happening, but also feels like it's several years ago, we've heard a lot about critical race theory, right? And we've heard a lot of attacks on that. We've heard a lot about Black lives being lost in various capacities. That takes its toll on folks who are Black and other folks of color, right? Because there's that level of exhaustion and this feeling that in a white-centered culture, we owe our truths to other people, right? So that can be exhausting. However, if you're watching this, you might think, Hannah, we're all tired. And yes, we are. We're all living through a pandemic that just doesn't seem to go away, right? There's been a series of research done as recently as last year, because again, we're only on the 6th today, that women in particular are feeling this exhaustion more than men. Perhaps that's because women traditionally occupy caretaking roles in the household as well as in the workplace. Burnout is real. Burnout is real professionally, personally, academically for those of you who are students, but it's something that disproportionately affects women and people of color, as you might imagine, specifically women of color. So between December of 2 years ago now and July of last year, US employees reported a 21% increase of burnout and a 17% increase of physical symptoms of stress. Those symptoms can mimic COVID in a lot of ways too, right? So tightness in the chest, tension, inability to breathe. 48% of US employees felt that exhaustion was mental and physical. So starting off the workday already looking forward to being in your bed at the end of the night, right? I know some of us, or probably all of us, have been there at some point, but for folks of color, this is even more pervasive because data doesn't lie in terms of that, right? In the workplace, folks of color are statistically more likely to feel this exhaustion. And so why I bring up general burnout as well as racial battle fatigue is that the combination of both of these things can be overwhelming. So not only are you, if you identify as a person of color or someone who's Black, not only are you dealing with the pandemic, with job responsibilities, with maybe tensions at home or what have you, you're also dealing with the onslaught of racist media messaging, of horrible news, of having to sit in a workspace not knowing if someone's going to say something kind of out of line, right? And I want to emphasize that racial battle fatigue is a health issue because it has all of these horrible symptoms that you see here. So suppressed immunity, the last thing anyone wants going through a pandemic, right? Increased sickness, tension headaches. I don't know about y'all, but like feeling stiff, feeling unhappy, stress, anxiety, ulcers, feeling withdrawn, feeling like you can't connect to those support services, which are strained, but are out there for some of us to access, right? So it's kind of this entire picture of just feeling peak exhausted and feeling like you're unable to get support that you need and deserve because we're not in a society that encourages that, right? Especially not when our society is exhausted as a whole. So I want to highlight racial battle fatigue because we all deal with imposter syndrome, which is our next Tuesday training. So please join us for that. We all deal with a little bit of emotional labor, right? Trying to have to manage the feelings of others, trying to make sure everyone's doing well. But when it comes to our friends of color, to employees of color, there's this feeling of not feeling worthy because that's the message that other folks have put on you, right? People telling you don't belong. You can internalize that, right? Like racism is systemic, but it can also be something that you experience and in ways that you may not be able to sort of verbalize, right? So when we're having these compounding traumas, these compounding stressors for folks of color, it makes it feel a little bit or a lot of bit overwhelming, right? So why I bring this up is because it is a public health crisis. When we look at medical data, Black women are physically, or rather biologically, 7.5 years older than their white counterparts. So think about that for a wee second. So for Black women, for the amount of stress that they carry on their strong shoulders, it takes its toll. You probably know someone going prematurely gray because of stress. If you don't, it's me. You probably know people who are feeling more burnt out, more run down. We cannot ignore the fact that as tired as we feel, others might be feeling that too in different ways. And I want to uplift this. Before we go into our Allyship Institute next month, which is another shameless plug, I want us to know that for the Black community in particular, this fatigue happens on so many levels, and it feels like there's no way to get out of it, right? And these indicators of perceived stress, account for so much of this difference. The lack of equity in terms of the job market, in terms of any public or interpersonal social sphere that you can think of, adds to this fatigue. So how can we support our colleagues of color? So if you're in a workplace, perhaps you yourself are a white ally, you might be thinking, gosh, Hannah, this is really depressing. What can I do to help? So when you see anyone who's in a tricky or unhealthy, unhappy situation that is caused by microaggression, so again, people asking to touch each other's hair, people discrediting other people's success. I want to quote Dr. Irene Ota here. She says that it is our job as allies, particularly to Black folks, and all folks of color, all folks of different gender identities and sexual orientations, it is our job to intervene and speak up. We've heard a lot about the new normal, and again, it's 2022 now somehow. The new normal ain't coming, so we're trying to craft it as we go along. We have to speak up when we see things that are unfair happening. We get to use I statements. So instead of putting that fatigue on someone else, instead of making someone else feel responsible for their trauma, whether it's a bad joke in an office meeting or whether it's something systemically larger, we want to own the I of that issue. So I see you, I hear you, what can I do to help? So spending our own privileges, enacting our own agency to help other people, and then to be a co-witness. One of the things about racism and racial battle fatigue is that when you are the only, in my case, immigrant in a space, or the only person of color in a space, it feels a little bit like gaslighting. If no one else can see the hurt that you're going through, if everyone else thinks the racist or sexist jokes are funny, you might think, well, am I the problem? Am I going crazy? So having folks from the majority group, or in this case, white allies, affirm that that ain't okay, you deserve to be treated with respect, can be huge. So using your voice and spending your privilege to support other communities of color. And in terms of alleviating the actual symptoms of it, again, racial battle fatigue, RBF, not the other RBF, does come with a number of physiological symptoms. So knowing that if you're in a supervisory role, Black respondents and female respondents of color respond better to flexible schedules. We've all had to be a little bit more adaptable amidst all things COVID, right? So allowing for flexibility, knowing that we bring our whole selves to work even when we don't want to, right? So if you're a supervisor or if you have a colleague and you can help out, maybe it's a hard day. Again, today's the anniversary of a really difficult event for so many people across different demographics, right? Perhaps there's been, another verdict that's announced that's really hard for folks to process. Understanding that, using your I statement to say, I see you, I see that this is hard, what can I do to help? So increasing that compassion and that kindness again, along all lines of demographics, but knowing that for folks of color, there are different triggers that are especially hard to get through. So as supervisors, if you are a supervisor, spending that privilege in ways that honor the entirety of a person and offering flexibility where possible. So as I mentioned, back to normal at whose expense, or is there a normal? For those of us who are working remotely, you can tell I have been recording these videos all around my house, whichever room is cleanest. We know that a significantly larger population of executives compared to employees want to be in the office. There's this hustle culture. There's this idea of we want to get back to normal, 2022, let's go. Maybe you have a resolution. I'm not going to lie, I don't. There's a treadmill, haven't used it. But we want to honor that we might be in a better position than some of our employees or some of our other colleagues. We might feel better equipped to tackle the year ahead, the day ahead. So honoring flexibility for others. We want to know that hybrid work might work better for some. So to whatever degree you have, whether it's in your friend groups, your workplace, your family dynamic, trying to consider what would be most helpful to folks who have a different background than me, right? And then for allies, our last little call to action, normalize conversations on wellness. As a country, we've done a lot better in terms of addressing things like mindfulness, things like, how can I take care of myself? What are healthy boundaries? It's okay to talk about that. It's okay to normalize being okay and also not being okay. For folks who might be watching this who have kids, the stress of knowing that your baby's coming home as potentially a primary contact for COVID, right? For parents to young Black kids, how scary it is to hear another news story and wonder that your baby's going to be okay. So to talk about those things in safe spaces, right? To normalize anxiety, not in a way that we encourage it or just say, well, everybody's anxious, but ways that we try to tackle it and help each other along, right? For those of you who are in supervisory positions, expecting and demanding more equitable practices and structures, right? So all things COVID have shown us that we can adapt how we work, right? typically a majority of us weren't working from our living rooms, right? Some of us don't have that privilege, but some of us have been able to. So as we look towards the year ahead, thinking about ways we can increase flexibility and wellness so that we can minimize this fatigue, particularly for our folks of color. And then not turning anyone into your personal Google. So as we look to the year, as we think of all of the upcoming events this year that may be wonderful and those that will no doubt not be so great, trying to remember that we are all sponges to our environment, right? We're all taking in different information and processing it differently. And for folks of color who've lived with intergenerational trauma, trying to show kindness, not asking, hey, what do you think about this insert horrible incident here, right? Trying to offer support instead of demand education from people of color. As I said, it's literally my job to be an educator in this field. I always share my email. I welcome all questions, particularly because it's a job that I've chosen, knowing that I've been in spaces where this has been a job I didn't choose. There's been situations where I've been wanting to do, a work inventory and instead have to defend my race or culture or what have you. So try not to put extra labor on your communities of color. And then for my friends of color who are watching, one of my favorite gifts here to share, or GIFs, depending on how you pronounce it, to breathe. I don't think I've taken a breath this whole presentation, but that's kind of par for the course for me. So protect your peace. Racial battle fatigue is not a one and done, read a book, solve it. It's ongoing. Life continues on, we all hope, right? And it comes with any number of stressors, any number of triggers that remind us how society has historically and still currently does not value Black lives or lives of color. So you're allowed to protect your peace. You do not have to consume all of the news ever. You do not need to be an expert on every aspect of your lived identity, even when other folks kind of require you to be. That's not fair. Send them my email again, right? Like that's what we're here to do here, is to educate and support. So implementing those healthy boundaries. Perhaps you're in a workspace and something racist was said and maybe none of your friends or colleagues are sticking up for you, asking to take a minute. Doing so respectfully, or as respectfully as one can, of course, but knowing that you are allowed to thrive and not just survive. And then to my friends of color, to my Black colleagues and loved ones and everyone else, right? Reconnecting with your community. Particularly for Black folks, it can often feel like the only time we see a Black life represented in the media is when it's hard, is when it's horrible. So turn on Grand Crew, turn on a show or listen to some music that allows you to celebrate your identity. So while I do not identify as Black, though I am African, I never get to see positive representation of the Middle East, and it's really depressing. So trying to find, podcasts or music or media that is essentially by us for us. And so I encourage folks to do that, because too often when we're people in the minority group, it's always a struggle. It's always framed as an oppression. And so just this friendly reminder as we kick off this year that it doesn't have to be, that we don't have to subscribe to that, and that you are allowed to celebrate your life. And that sort of helps mitigate a little bit of that racial battle fatigue, or at least we do hope so. And so that is our very first Think About It Thursday for 2022. Here's hoping for a happier year ahead, and I'll see you on Tuesday for our next training.